Call Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to follow on from that member, because I think probably one of the more significant omissions that she made in her address was to acknowledge the work of yourself, Mr. Chair, as one of the drafter of this legislation, which obviously Labor will be supporting. But I also want to just acknowledge that it's good to be here to discuss a piece of sensible law and order based policy, because I have to say, and it was a Labor courtesy of Rick Barker bill, because I have been disappointed with the debate that has been in this House around law and order and justice matters of late. Probably the more recent bill that comes to mind is the 3 strikes. And I have to say that I have to acknowledge my disappointment in the Minister of Justice, Simon Power, on his position on this, because whilst the likes of members like Sandra Gowdy may be all for things like 3 strikes, I think that members such as the Minister may actually acknowledge that it's a retrograde, backward step which all of the international experts are clamouring to come to New Zealand and help us before we go down that.
Point of order. Jonathan Young.
The bill. Thank you.
I'll respond to the member by saying that the National Party's previous speaker, according to my calculation of the clock, he spent 2 minutes discussing the membership of the Law and Order Select Committee to the merriment of the National Party bench. I could have taken a point of order and brought them back, because that was well outside the scope of the bill. So I'm allowing a little bit of lassitude. There's a bit of give and take here. But having taken the point of order, I'm not going to remember the ruling, but the point has been made to the Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I note I have 1:30 to then dwell on other matters left, and I'll save that for a little later on in my bill, but I think in my speech. But I think the point has been made. I do want to come back to the bill, which ultimately is an omnibus bill. Obviously, it amends 20 bills in total, so I acknowledge it would have been a significant piece of work for the ministry. But ultimately, this bill does focus on the recovery of unpaid fines, but there are 2 elements within that. I think the efficiency of which those fine collections take place should be primary in our discussion, and there are some parts of Labor's original bill that have not been picked up in that regard that I might like to touch on briefly. And also there are elements in here where the Ministry of Justice, I think rightly so, has pointed out that we do always have to take into account the difficult balance between inserting realism into our fine collection system, whilst not allowing offenders to abdicate their ultimate responsibility as part of their punishment as awarded by the court. So there's always a very difficult balancing act in there. And in all of that mix, we have to make sure we maintain a credible fine system, both in terms of awarding of those fines and in terms of their collection. Just to touch briefly on Labor's position, obviously we support the bill, but I think I'd have to say express some disappointment in the speed at which this bill, which was essentially ready in 2008, the speed in which it has been brought before this House, and as I mentioned briefly, the omissions in this bill. And one in particular I'd like to touch on is the overarching agency which was originally proposed to have responsibility for fines. At the moment, we have multiple points of collection, fine collection, multiple agencies involved in that role. We sought to address that. That, for some reason, has not been included in this legislation. I would hope that if there isn't some discussion about that in Select Committee, that perhaps in the committee stages, the Minister might like to address that point further. The government, though, in its absence of addressing that point, has said that these are the most comprehensive set of legislative measures to collect unpaid monies in 12 years. I do think that the Honourable David Parker touched on the other significant actions that Labor took when we were in government. But the government is now claiming it demonstrates their determination to address the high level of unpaid monies. But again, I find the timing on this quite interesting. Some of the stats we already know is that between July 2008 and June 2009, the courts wiped 95.1 million of the total 806 million in unpaid fines. I would have thought that perhaps at the same time the government was looking to make that decision, it may have spent some time making sure it was progressing this piece of legislation so it had a dual track on fine collection. And also, given the large and growing amount of outstanding penalties, I think perhaps there is a wider debate to be had over the role of monetary penalties as a sanction for offending and whether or not that's being eroded as the level of monetary fines unpaid continue to accrue. But that is a significant debate, I think, and one probably best had at Select Committee. I think as well it was a worthwhile point that the regulatory impact statement said that as at 31 May 2008, credit reporting would have affected over 270,000 people who owed more than 400 million in overdue fines. I think what we're seeing there is the concentration of individuals, much in the same way that we have a concentration of individuals committing a large amount of our crime in New Zealand, particularly in the youth justice sector. We have a small amount of individuals who are responsible for a large number of overdue fines and penalties. And perhaps in response to that, that's why we've seen unpaid fines remitted to community work has more than tripled over the last 5 years. Now, I want to just pick up on that a little later on, but this does point, I think, to perhaps the question of when the court is awarding or handing down a fine, whether or not it's taking fully into account some of the provisions, for instance, of the Sentencing Act, which does require that ability to pay is taken into account. Now, I want to again highlight this should not be used as a tool to abdicate from the responsibility an individual has to make amends through our sentencing regime. But it does say if an individual is being awarded a fine where it's blatantly obvious at that point that their ability to pay is limited, that would be the point at which we would be best to hand down a sentence where they will be obliged to fulfil their debt to the society, rather than having the fine fall upon them, squander, go through unpaid, and then eventually translate into community work. So that's why I think that front-end process is very, very important. I would think it would be useful if at some point the Minister could share with us perhaps why there was an extension of time. If this bill was ready in 2008, why we have had a delay, whether or not there was some redrafting that took place, whether or not there was some extra information that was required, because it doesn't seem immediately obvious to me. And if indeed it's because the government has been busy implementing legislation like 3 strikes, then the only assumption I can make is that their priorities are all wrong. I do want to touch on some of the main provisions of the bill. I think my colleague David Parker did a very good job, though, of pulling out some of the issues that the Select Committee may like to spend greater time on. We've obviously had the attachment orders, which are allowed deductions to be made from wages and benefits to pay debts. This was something that the Justice and Electoral Committee touched on briefly when we were looking at the government's proposal to impose a blanket $50 tax, I guess, on individual offenders. And I would just point out to the Law and Order Committee, who I understand will be considering this, that it may be useful to look at the impact of deductions if, for instance, they're coming from small businesses. It's a cost on them that we haven't considered, and it's just something perhaps worth looking at. The credit reporting initiative, which David Parker again pointed out was a useful one, and the super priority in which the district court can obtain higher priority over secured property of a credit provider if the loan was advanced when the overdue penalties could have been released under the credit reporting proposal. I just want to throw in here an unintended consequence or a related matter which the government may wish to consider. If we're dealing with individuals who obviously find themselves in an economic situation where they're not paying their fines despite being pursued, and we are putting an order of priority on their repayments, we may find situations where some of those debtors look to other channels in order to pay off their debts. and that may may lead to them seeking out, for instance, unsavoury loan sharks. Now, if the government wanted to be truly comprehensive of making sure there was no unintended consequences of what are otherwise good measures, perhaps they would consider supporting Carol Beaumont's Members' Bill, which cracks down on loan sharks that often have